January 20th, 1942, Berlin. The Reich Chancellery stood cloaked in winter fog, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness of a city at war. Inside, in a smoke-filled chamber lined with maps and production charts, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring leaned back in his chair, a cigar between his fingers. Before him lay an intercepted intelligence report, numbers so absurd, so impossible, that he laughed aloud in front of his staff. The report claimed that across the Atlantic, the United States had set itself a goal to produce 60,000 warplanes in a single year, and eventually as many as 100,000 annually. Göring exhaled smoke and sneered. The Americans build refrigerators and cars, not warplanes. It is absurd. His generals chuckled nervously, but the Reichsmarschall was certain. The Luftwaffe, which had brought Europe to its knees in Poland and France, was still considered the most formidable air force in the world. Germany had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, the dive bomber, and precision air-ground coordination. The idea that American civilians, auto workers, factory women, even mechanics who had never touched an aircraft before, could churn out more planes than Germany's vast military industry was laughable. Göring waved the paper dismissively. They are dreamers. America will drown in its own arrogance before it builds such numbers. But across the ocean, in Detroit and Seattle, Los Angeles and Buffalo, the roar of industry was already rising. Henry Ford's assembly lines were being redesigned, not for cars but for bombers. Boeing engineers were laying out plans for mass-produced flying fortresses. Thousands of women were lining up outside factory gates, ready to take up drills and rivet guns. What Göring dismissed as fantasy was in reality the birth of an industrial storm. And before long, the skies over Germany would be darkened not by a few squadrons, but by armadas of American aircraft, built in numbers that no dictator, no Reichsmarschall ever thought possible.
To understand why Göring scoffed at the American numbers, we need to step back to the years before the United States entered the war. In 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, the American Army Air Corps was a modest force. The United States had only about 3,000 combat-ready aircraft in service, many of them obsolete biplanes or early monoplanes that would have looked fragile next to the sleek German Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the terrifying Stuka dive bomber. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, had already become the sharpest sword of the Third Reich, boasting more than 8,000 modern aircraft and a doctrine honed through brutal practice in Spain during the Civil War. By 1940, the world had witnessed what German air power could do. In Poland, waves of Stukas shattered defenses in minutes. In France, the Luftwaffe's relentless assaults on bridges, railroads, and French columns paralyzed an entire army. And in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain brought dogfights and bombing raids to the skies over London and Dover. Although Britain survived, it had been a near-run thing, and even Winston Churchill admitted that the Luftwaffe had come close to knocking Britain out of the war. Compared to this, America looked like a sleeping giant, slumbering behind its oceans. Its armed forces ranked only 17th in size in the world in 1939, smaller than Portugal's. Its aviation industry was geared for peacetime, building fewer than 3,000 planes a year, most of them civilian trainers or mail carriers. Few in Berlin believed that such a nation, slow to act and reluctant to arm itself, could ever rival Germany's dedicated war machine.
And yet, one man in Washington had already recognized the danger. In December 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation in what became known as the Arsenal of Democracy speech. His voice crackled over the radio waves. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must build planes, ships, guns, and ammunition to arm our allies who are fighting for freedom. Roosevelt set an almost unthinkable target, 50,000 planes a year. Newspapers doubted it. Industry leaders muttered it was madness. Even many Americans wondered whether such numbers were a fantasy. But Roosevelt understood something fundamental. While Germany had built its strength through centralized military control, the United States possessed an unmatched advantage: its vast, flexible industrial base. Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh and Los Angeles were home not to war factories, but to car plants, steel mills, and assembly lines that could be converted. The same system that produced millions of Model Ts, refrigerators, and radios could, with the right leadership, be turned into a machine for war. And to lead that transformation, Roosevelt turned not to generals, but to businessmen. He summoned William Knudsen, president of General Motors, and Henry Ford, the legendary automaker, to Washington. Their task? To turn America's consumer economy into the world's greatest war industry. In 1940, Germany built around 10,000 aircraft. America built fewer than 3,000. Within 4 years, those numbers would be reversed and multiplied many times over.
The transformation began quietly, but once it gathered momentum, it became unstoppable. By early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, American industry was already being retooled. Automobile plants that once produced Buicks and Fords were stripped of their tooling equipment and redesigned to churn out wings, fuselages, and engines. Franklin Roosevelt's gamble that civilian industry could be turned into a military powerhouse was paying off faster than anyone had imagined. One of the most dramatic examples was the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by the Ford Motor Company. Willow Run was conceived as the largest factory in the world under a single roof, stretching nearly a mile long. Henry Ford promised that his assembly lines, which had once put America on wheels, could now put bombers into the sky. At first, critics laughed. Building a 4-engine bomber like the B-24 Liberator was far more complex than a Model T. The bomber had 350,000 individual parts and required 13,000 man-hours to assemble. But Ford's engineers adapted their methods, breaking the process down into stages of precision assembly. By 1944, Willow Run was producing one B-24 every 55 minutes. It was mass production applied to the most sophisticated war machines of the age. And Ford was not alone. General Motors, Lockheed, Boeing, Douglas, and North American Aviation all threw their weight behind the effort. Plants in Seattle, California, and Kansas became cities of riveters, welders, and engineers. Inglewood, California saw North American's P-51 Mustang roll off the lines, while Douglas Aircraft built the rugged C-47 transport that would carry paratroopers into Normandy. Across the nation, entire supply chains were reoriented toward one goal: build planes and then build more planes.
But industry alone could not win this battle. It needed people. And here, the social fabric of America changed forever. With millions of men drafted into the armed forces, women entered the factories in unprecedented numbers. By 1943, over 300,000 women were working in the aircraft industry alone. They became known as Rosie the Riveters, a symbol of resilience with rolled-up sleeves, red bandana, and determined gaze. For many, it was their first time earning wages and contributing to heavy industry, and they proved more than equal to the task. Rivets clanged, welders sparked, and the sound of hammers echoed in cavernous hangars. Productivity soared. In 1939, it had taken an American factory an average of 200 days to build a single aircraft. By 1943, streamlined methods meant many could be completed in less than 2 weeks. Standardization became the key. Parts were interchangeable, designs simplified, and workers trained for repetitive precision. A worker who once made kitchen appliances might now install landing gear, while another who had stitched car upholstery was now sewing parachutes. The results stunned the world. In 1942, the United States produced 47,800 aircraft, already outstripping Germany's annual output. By 1943, the number leapt to over 85,000. And in 1944, America came within reach of Roosevelt's impossible dream: 96,000 planes built in a single year. To put that into perspective, it meant the U.S. produced more planes in 1944 alone than Germany managed during the entire course of the war. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who had once doubted America's intervention in Europe, visited factories and wrote with astonishment, "The industrial power of this nation is beyond imagination. We are building planes faster than the Germans can shoot them down." This was the turning point. What Göring had dismissed as absurd in 1942 was now a daily reality. America had not only caught up, it had surpassed every other nation on Earth. And soon, the skies over Europe would reveal the consequences.
By 1943, the consequences of American production were being felt in the skies over Europe. The once invincible Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war, now faced an enemy it could not outbuild and could no longer intimidate. The shift came during the Allied strategic bombing campaigns against Germany. Beginning in 1942, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, flying from bases in Britain, struck deep into the Reich. At first, the missions were costly. Without long-range escort fighters, American bomber groups suffered horrific losses over targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. In one raid alone, in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day, over 600 men. Göring sneered, confident that such losses would cripple American resolve. But Göring had gravely misjudged the scale of American industry. Every bomber lost could be replaced. Every aircrew lost would be retrained and replaced. New waves of aircraft kept arriving from factories across the Atlantic, and with them came a new weapon that changed the balance, the P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. By late 1943, American skies over Germany bristled not just with bombers, but with swarms of sleek Mustangs and Thunderbolts tearing into the Luftwaffe with deadly efficiency.
The moment of reckoning arrived in February 1944, during what came to be known as Big Week. For 6 consecutive days, American bombers, thousands strong, pounded German aircraft factories, assembly plants, and ball bearing works. Göring had once boasted to his men, "If even a single bomb falls on the Ruhr, you may call me Meyer." Yet by 1944, bombs were falling not just on the Ruhr, but on Berlin itself, raining down day after day, escorted by American fighters that shredded German defenses. The statistics were staggering. In just 1 week, the Allies flew more than 3,500 bombing sorties, dropping nearly 10,000 tons of bombs. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had, but the Americans kept coming. In one clash, the P-51s shot down over 200 German fighters in a single day. What had begun as a contest of courage and tactics had become a contest of numbers, and numbers were on America's side. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, would later admit with grim clarity, "We had underestimated the Americans' capacity for mass production. We knew their factories were large, but we never imagined they could sustain such losses and replace them with more machines, more crews, more fuel." From that point forward, German skies belonged to the Allies. By D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe could barely muster 300 aircraft to oppose 13,000 Allied planes covering the Normandy invasion. Göring, once so proud of his Luftwaffe, privately confessed, "We have no chance. They have the factories, they have the fuel, they have the men." The climax had arrived. The Reich's dream of air dominance was shattered. The endless waves of American bombers and fighters, built by workers thousands of miles away, proved that Göring's laughter in 1942 had been a fatal mistake. While bombers darkened the skies of Europe, the true battle was being won thousands of miles away on the factory floors of America. Here, the war was not fought with rifles or tanks, but with drills, welding torches, and assembly lines, and it was this hidden front, the home front, that became decisive. Consider Willow Run in Michigan.
At its peak, more than 40,000 workers streamed in and out of the plant every day. The factory covered 3.5 million square feet, and its mile-long assembly line turned raw aluminum and steel into 4-engine B-24 bombers. Newspapers called it the arsenal of democracy under one roof. By mid-1944, Willow Run was producing nearly 500 bombers a month. Each morning when the doors opened, one bomber would roll off the line. By sunset, another was ready. To German planners who believed complex aircraft could only be built by elite craftsmen, such industrial scale was unthinkable. And Willow Run was just one of dozens. In Seattle, Boeing employed more than 50,000 men and women to construct the B-17 Flying Fortress, the plane that became the backbone of daylight bombing. In California, Douglas Aircraft produced the C-47 Transport, the workhorse of Allied logistics, at a rate of 1 every 5 hours. In Kansas, North American Aviation churned out P-51 Mustangs by the thousands. The scale was staggering. By 1944, Boeing alone was producing 16 B-17s per day.
The workers themselves became part of America's war story. With millions of men drafted, women surged into the workforce. By 1943, women made up 1/3 of the entire aviation workforce, around 300,000 strong. They drilled rivets, welded frames, stitched parachutes, and tested engines. Rosie the Riveter was more than propaganda. She was reality. In Detroit, women worked side by side with men on bomber lines. In Seattle, mothers with young children left them in newly built daycares beside the factory gates. African American workers, often barred from skilled jobs before the war, now found opportunities in war plants, although not without struggles against segregation and prejudice. Immigrants, farmers, students, all found themselves united by a single mission: build planes, and build them fast. The statistics were breathtaking. A single B-17 required 350,000 parts and 13 miles of wiring. Yet with assembly line methods, American factories churned them out at a rate the Luftwaffe could scarcely believe. By war's end, the United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories built 96,000 planes, compared to Germany's 39,000.
Technology played its role as well. Standardization and interchangeable parts meant that one factory could build wings, another fuselages, and another engines, all shipped by rail to final assembly plants. Ford's genius was not just mass production, but decentralization, splitting tasks so no single bottleneck could slow the system. Logistics networks carried steel from Pittsburgh, aluminum from Tennessee, and rubber from the South to distant assembly plants. Fuel flowed from newly developed oil fields, while training programs churned out tens of thousands of mechanics, pilots, and support crews. This was not merely an industrial achievement. It was a social revolution. For the first time, women and minorities were entering fields previously closed to them. The war blurred lines between civilian and military, between factory and battlefield. When a B-24 lifted into the sky, it carried with it the sweat of thousands of hands, the rhythm of countless machines, and the determination of a nation that had transformed itself in record time. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, would later write in his memoirs, "The war was decided by the superiority of American production and the generosity with which they used it." He admitted that no matter how brilliant German engineering was, it could not match the relentless flood of machines coming from across the Atlantic. Behind every bomber formation that thundered over the Reich stood the men and women of the American home front. Ordinary people who had become, in Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy.
By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the proud weapon that had shattered Europe in the early years of the war. Instead, it was a shadow of its former self: bleeding aircraft, fuel, and above all, pilots. For every German fighter that took to the skies, America could send 5 more. For every squadron lost, the factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles replaced them tenfold. The statistics were merciless. In 1940, the Luftwaffe had dominated with 10,000 modern aircraft. By 1944, Germany managed to produce around 39,000 planes, a record for them, but it was a hollow achievement. The Allies had built nearly 100,000 in the same year. Or still, Germany lacked the fuel to fly its new aircraft and the trained pilots to man them. Shortages forced training programs to be slashed from 2 years to barely 3 months. Green boys barely out of flight school were sent against swarms of P-51 Mustangs flown by seasoned American aces. Losses were catastrophic. Even Germany's technological marvels, like the jet-powered Me-262, came too late and in too few numbers. For every jet that rolled out, dozens of American bombers and escorts waited overhead. Albert Speer recalled in 1944, "We had underestimated not only the numbers the Americans could build, but the speed at which they could replace losses. We could not keep pace." The psychological collapse was just as devastating. Göring, once bombastic and arrogant, was reduced to despair. After the catastrophic raids of Big Week and the relentless bombardment that followed, he admitted to his staff, "We have no chance. They have the factories, they have the fuel, they have the men. We are finished." It was the same Göring who only 2 years earlier had scoffed at the idea of America producing 100,000 aircraft. Now, he sat in his headquarters listening to the distant thunder of Allied bombers hammering the Reich day after day.
The collapse of the Luftwaffe sealed Germany's fate. When the Allies launched the D-Day invasion in June 1944, American and British planes filled the skies with over 13,000 aircraft. German resistance was negligible. Luftwaffe fighters that tried to challenge the Armada were swatted down by Mustangs before they could even reach the beaches. German soldiers on the ground described the skies as a solid wall of planes. For the Wehrmacht, deprived of air cover, every movement by daylight became a death sentence. Tanks, trucks, trains, all were hunted by Allied aircraft that seemed to own the skies. By the winter of 1944-45, the Luftwaffe was essentially broken. American bombers roamed Germany almost at will, destroying synthetic fuel plants, railways, and factories. Fighter pilots, many barely teenagers, were thrown into hopeless missions. In January 1945 alone, Germany lost nearly 2,000 planes in combat, while America was still building thousands every month. It was the final confirmation of what Speer later wrote. The war had been decided not only on the battlefield, but in the factories. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had collapsed under the weight of American industry. What Göring had mocked as fantasy had become Germany's nightmare.
In the end, Germany's greatest miscalculation was not on the battlefield, but in the factories. Hermann Göring had laughed at the thought of America producing 100,000 planes in a year. Yet by 1944, the United States was building nearly that many, and by war's end had rolled out more than 300,000 aircraft, more than the Axis powers combined. The skies above Europe bore witness to that industrial miracle, where formations of flying fortresses and liberators blotted out the sun, escorted by Mustangs that no Luftwaffe squadron could withstand. What this revealed was a deeper truth, that in modern war, victory belongs not only to the soldiers at the front, but to the workers, engineers, and leaders who mobilize a nation's strength. Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy was not rhetoric, it was reality. America's free market industries, when unleashed under national purpose, became a weapon as decisive as any bomb or bullet. Winston Churchill captured it best. The United States is like a giant boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. That fire, lit after Pearl Harbor, roared with a force that consumed the Axis. The moral is clear. Tyrannies may rise quickly with rigid discipline and centralized power, but democracies, once awakened, wield an energy that is limitless. Göring's laughter in 1942 became his regret in 1945. For history had proven that America's strength lay not in boasting, but in building. And in the end, it built enough to change the world.